Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Hello and welcome to part 3 of Batman the Complete Retrospective, a series where I trace the evolution of the Dark Knight through his early days and watch him grow and evolve into one of the most popular characters in American fiction. If you're new here, then welcome, and if you're not, then welcome back. If this is the first retrospective that you're watching, then feel free to jump back to the beginning to see where we've been. But if not, then just enjoy this one. The first video in this series is my very first YouTube video ever. So if you watch these videos from the beginning, you may see some differences in quality as I slowly become more comfortable with being on camera and more skilled at editing videos and setting up my microphone. But regardless, I'm still very proud of those videos and of this series so far, and I'm excited to see the places that it'll go. But without further ado, let's just jump right in. In this video, I'll be covering Detective Comics numbers 73 to 100, Batman 15 to 28, and World's Finest Comics numbers 9 to 17. These issues were published from March of 1943 to June of 1945. Writers include Bill Finger, Don Cameron, Horace L. Gold, Joseph Green, Joe Simaxton, Alvin Schwartz, Mort Weisinger, Edmund Hamilton, and Jack Schiff. Pencils, inks, letters, or cover art are credited to Bob Kane, Jerry Robinson, George Rousseau's, Jack Burnley, Ray Burnley, Dick Sprang, Stan Kay, Norman Fallon, Charles Paris, Gene McDonald, Ira Schnapp, Ed Cressy, and Pat Gordon. As you can tell, the demanding output that came from producing Batman had expanded the creative teams considerably. And not only did it give Kane and Finger some much-needed slack, but it also served as a launchpad for many early comic book creators to hone their craft, though none of them were credited for their work at the time. But one of the first big reactions that I had as I moved into this leg of 50 issues, and one that I wrote down constantly over and over again in my notes, was, God, I love Dick Sprang's artwork. Something I haven't really touched on yet, more so because I usually like to only include my positive opinions in these videos, is that I don't really think that Bob Kane's artwork is very good. It's serviceable, sure, but it can make the reading process annoying at some points when I can't really even understand what's going on in certain panels. And it kind of makes it all the worse when you realize that Kane was getting 100% of the credit 100% of the time. I only bring this up now because it becomes all the more apparent when Dick Sprang joins to start providing artwork. A big part of this process has been learning who joined Batman and when, because as more and more creators start adding their own styles and flares to the character, we can see how this influences the evolution of the character, either thematically or visually. And Dick Sprang was one of the most legendary Batman artists to ever work on the character, both in the Golden Age and in the comic book eras beyond. Funnily enough, Sprang was originally brought aboard by editor Whitney Ellsworth to create inventoried art for the Batman stories due to fears at the time that Bob Kane was going to be drafted into the war. But by 1943, he was a full-time artist for Batman, working as an uncredited ghost artist for Bob Kane, which is what everyone did at the time. Sprang's Batman is characterized by his square chin, his expressive face, and his barrel chest. And I'd wager to say that if you've seen classic Batman artwork from the 40s or the 50s, it's probably by Dick Sprang. I know, at least for me, that this version of Batman is the one that comes to the forefront of my mind when I hear the term Golden Age, and I imagine it is for many others. But in this era of Batman, Dick Sprang was not the only addition to the comic book, and he wasn't even the most important one. That title, of course, has to go to Alfred, Bruce Wayne's butler and closest confidant, who was introduced in Batman number 16. But the introduction and evolution of the character is not quite as cut and dry as it may seem at first. It's important to point out that during this next phase of Batman comics, two important pieces of media were being produced outside of the three mainline series of Batman, Detective Comics, and World's Finest. The first was a Sunday newspaper strip that was printed between 1943 and 1946, and the other was the theatrical Batman serial from 1943. Now, if you're curious about either of those and you want to know more, then don't panic. In fact, part 4 of this series is going to solely be about those two pieces of media. This is a complete retrospective, after all. And as you'll learn, these two did have tangible impacts on the evolution of the character throughout the years. That's all going to be coming, but you really only need to know a few things right now. The theatrical serial was set to premiere in July of 1943, and it would serve as the first appearance of the character of Alfred, who was conceived by writers Victor MacLeod, Leslie Swabacker, and Harry Fraser. But after talks between the producers and the editors of National Comics, they decided to premiere the character 3 months earlier in Batman number 16 in April of 1943. But the funny thing is, Bob Kane and Don Cameron imagined the character of Alfred as a portly, rotund British man. But when the serial premiered over the summer, Alfred was portrayed by character actor William Austin, who was tall and skinny and sported a very distinctive mustache. So then the editors wanted Alfred to resemble his cinematic counterpart. So in Detective Comics 83, they had Alfred vacation to a health resort and essentially just come back looking like William Austin. And this version of Alfred is the one that has endured for nearly 8 decades. Okay, you got all that? At this point, Alfred hasn't been given a last name, but what we do know about him is that his father, Jarvis, was the butler for Thomas and Martha Wayne. Alfred is often given character traits and skills that fit the situation, like the fact that he played rugby or that he was once part of the British theater. But the most prominent of Alfred's traits are really 3 things. 1, he loves detective stories. 2, he's super clumsy. And 3, he's super loyal. And these all work together to create a really endearing character. In Batman 16, he essentially just shows up to Bruce's doorstep unannounced and just informs Bruce and Dick that he will now be taking up his butlering duties. Batman and Robin are hesitant at first, but they don't have it in their hearts to turn Alfred away. After fighting off a burglar, he accidentally activates the button that leads him down the secret passages below Wayne Manor, and that's where he learns Bruce's secret identity. After that, Alfred becomes an integral part of the team, and the dynamic duo turns into the terrific trio. Alfred's role in these early stories combines the 3 traits that I had previously mentioned. Oftentimes, his passion for being an amateur detective will lead him to try and aid or help Batman and Robin in various ways, and he usually aids them through a combination of actual detective work and sheer dumb luck, and he often stumbles into solutions by pure accident. In fact, in 13 issues of Batman, we have these little 4-page vignettes called The Adventures of Alfred, where he solves crimes and catches bad guys by accident, and then doesn't have the heart to tell the police that he didn't actually do it on purpose. Most of these early comic books are short stories of no consequence anyways, and I find these to be especially endearing. But as I started to pay attention to all of Alfred's detective work, I began to realize that there was something that I haven't covered yet in either part 1 or part 2. And that is, of course, Batman's role as a detective. I mean, one of his 2 solo books is literally called Detective Comics. And I think I've been so wrapped up in Batman as the superhero, I've rarely touched on Batman as the detective. So I think that it's important to also point out that Batman finds some really creative ways to solve increasingly complex crimes. Something interesting to point out here is that oftentimes when Batman functions as a detective, it's a bit different from the whodunit stories that you'd normally find in something like Scooby-Doo, or even in some modern police procedurals. In those kinds of stories, you have a crime that's committed and a list of suspects where one stands out above the rest as the obvious choice, and then the main character collects clues, and then they reveal the culprit, who is usually someone of medium suspicion. On the other hand, a Batman story functions with a pretty set-in-stone formula. Step 1. Batman has an initial scrap with a criminal of choice, either a named adversary like the Penguin, or just low-level mobsters or thugs. Step 2. Clues are left behind for Batman to follow, and these can really take one of 2 forms. Form A, Batman and Robin have to learn what their nefarious plot is and stop it in time. Or B, they've already revealed the nefarious plot, and Batman has to learn where they're going to strike next. Step 3, Batman and Robin use a combination of science, critical thinking, and sleuthing to learn what they need to know. Step 4, they stop the villains with just enough time to spare. But it's mostly in part 3 that the writers get to put their full creativity on display. And it's here that we get some really good early detecting by Batman. In some stories, he might be using equipment at his secret lab to pull fingerprints off of the inside of a glove that was left at a crime scene. Or he might be using chemicals to recreate words on half-burnt pieces of paper. I really like these little moments because it shows that Batman's mind is just as refined as his body is, and how that puts him above the police in many ways. And speaking of the police, it's also important to point out that we are still very much in an era where Batman and Robin are very beloved by the police. In fact, Commissioner Gordon has literally made them official members of the GCPD at this point in the story. They play baseball with firefighters and cops, they spend a night assisting emergency medical teams, they publicly meet with the commissioner on top of GCPD headquarters with a giant bat light. They are fully allies of the police. And this really shouldn't be tough to understand. We're very much in an era of American history where it was really important to value obedience to authority. And so to show Batman and Robin constantly laughing in the faces of law enforcement was not going to be a very good look. In later years, his status as a vigilante is going to inspire outright hostility from the GCPD, but we haven't really reached that level of complexity in American comic books yet. But shifting away from Batman's allies, let's focus instead on some of his adversaries. This phase of 50 issues is what I would kind of call the rise of the B villains. And what I mean by that is many of Batman's most prominent A villains start to ramp down their appearances just a bit so that the creative teams can try out a few other adversaries to try and see what works and what doesn't. For me, it's a bit refreshing actually. Remember how in part 2 we had 12 Joker appearances? Which was over 20% of all the material. Now don't get me wrong, the main villains still have plenty of time to shine. Scarecrow, Catwoman, Joker, Penguin, and Two-Face all make reappearances here to varying degrees of success. I was struck by how they really can't nail down what Catwoman's name or backstory are, because she's retconned once again, now as a hairdresser named Elva Barr. You can say that Catwoman is a woman of many aliases, but I just think that no one was really paying attention or cared enough when they were writing her. Joker and Scarecrow don't have much going on that's new, but we do have Penguin starting to embrace a lot more of his quirks. And his most recent appearance has him establishing a lair in an old refrigeration factory, and he's completely coated it in ice and populated it with actual penguins. And he's even built himself a throne of ice, which is just fantastic. In a big turn of events, Two-Face actually got a full redemption arc in Detective Comics 80, after he accidentally shoots his girlfriend Gilda in a scuffle with Batman. He spends a year in prison, he gets a face operation, he proposes to Gilda, who survived, and then he runs off with her and leaves his life of crime. He even leaves Batman the scarred coin so that he can put it in his trophy room. This puts a pretty definitive cap on Two-Face's story, so I'll be interested to see when they reintroduce him and how they'll do it. I imagine they'll probably do it when they reach some sort of slump with their current rogues gallery and want to dip back into the reserves, but we'll see. But enough about the A villains. I could really tell that this period of time served as a big period of experimentation for the writers, and that's really evident in all of the B villains that they start introducing. Usually these villains would have one quirk, and they usually only feature in a few stories before either dying or being phased out. We've got the Robber Baron, the Crime Surgeon, the Cavalier, the Conjurer, the Blaze, Dr. Dreamo, and also a few appearances of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, who I would say are probably the most famous of Batman's lower echelon of rogues. The B villain that gets the most play here is definitely the Cavalier, who is really Mortimer Drake, who is one of Bruce's high society buddies. He's actually a pretty good foil to Bruce, because while Batman uses his fortune to help people, Mortimer uses his to become a supervillain who is obsessed with stealing exotic collectibles that you can't purchase legally. The Cavalier is pretty wacky, and he even tries to steal an entire live whale at one point, which I think is just so funny. One other villain worth mentioning is the Blaze, who uses weapons related to fire and smoke to pull off some of his criminal activities. He's probably just going to be a one-off villain, but I can definitely see in him some of the seeds that are being planted here that will eventually grow into a villain like the Firefly. In other news, we finally got the first appearance of the Batcave in Detective Comics 83. And so far, it just has a gym, a laboratory, and garages for the Batmobile and the Batplane, though the space is going to start getting expanded as the years wear on. The Gadget first appearances start happening less and less frequently now that Batman has such an established set of tools, but we still get some notable ones here, like tracking devices that can be used on vehicles, and an early incarnation of a handheld grappling hook called the Bat-Poon, which is just such an unfortunate name. And similar to the gadgets, I would say in this third part that the wackiness is starting to decline a bit, but that doesn't mean that the writers won't occasionally just flippantly introduce the most insane concept ever with no explanation. In fact, in World's Finest 11, we see that time travel exists, and in Batman 19, we discover that Atlantis is real. And those things are never mentioned again. But Robin does earn the love of the Atlantean princess. But it's also mentioned that Robin looks exactly like her brother. So much so that Robin was able to fool everyone by just dressing up in the prince's clothes. Never mind, doesn't matter, we're moving on, we don't need to dwell on it. What I am excited to see phased out here soon is the war propaganda, seen throughout essentially every issue set in this period of time. Batman's already fought Nazis on 2 more occasions. You can see how as the World War really started ramping up in these years, the messaging in American media became increasingly aggressive. World War II will be ending here in just a few months from where we're leaving off, so it will be interesting to enter into a new era and see the ways that Batman fiction begins to reflect the sentiments of a post-war America. But I think for now, that's a good place to leave it. Like I said earlier, the next place that our retrospective journey will take us is to the newspaper strip and the 1943 Batman film. So stay tuned for that video. I truly have no idea what to expect from either of those, or even how much I'm going to have to say, but I'm excited to see what they have in store. But I just wanted to say thanks for watching my video, and if you want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. I've got some other content on my channel that I'm pretty proud of, so feel free to browse my playlists and check out some of my other videos. I've got quite a few more ideas that I'm working on, but just be aware that these complete retrospectives are still being given tons of time and attention, and they should still be coming out at regular intervals. But that's all for now, so until I see you next time, thanks for watching, and have a good one.